Hello English Literature A-level students. This is a revision lecture for Christina Rossetti. You've had this PowerPoint already, but I've added some activities that will help you revise poetic form particularly, but Rossetti's poetry generally. Okay, so poetic form is the name of the kind of poem. It's a bit like genre in that respect. And poetic form is identified through rhyme scheme, and so that shapes the poem, and it's also moved along by rhythm or meter. So to quote, when sound and meaning work together, the music of the verse enacts the subject matter. And that's a way to think about what are you going to say about form. Okay, don't just say this is a sonnet. The music of the verse, that is the form, enacts the subject matter, that is the content. So you've got to say something about, here's the content of this sonnet, and this is the form of it, and together the form makes that content come alive. Not all of Rossetti's poems can be classified into a named poetic form. Okay, just like not every film is a genre film, not every poem has a named form, but every one that is using a named form, I'm going to explain on this PowerPoint. Remember in the exam not to just discuss remember to discuss how she uses the form, yeah, not just identifying which form she uses. It is good to identify the form she uses. It is even better to talk about how she uses the form, and these tasks should help. Okay, so some of the poems that we look at are narrative poems, and when we call a poem a narrative, it needs to be like have some of the features that we expect in stories. So characters, dialogue, settings, and a narrator. So the poems that we're focusing on for narrative poems include Goblin Market, Maud Clare, and An Apple Gathering. Unlike the other two, Goblin Market has no regular line length, no regular rhythm, or a regular rhyme scheme. That doesn't mean it doesn't have rhythm, and it doesn't mean it doesn't have rhyme. Okay, what we're saying is they're not regular. And Goblin Market doesn't use stanzas, it uses paragraph breaks. So we have those breaks that actually are a bit more like prose. They make that poem episodic. But with the other two poems, they sort of use ballad form. Okay, so there's this overarching idea of narrative poems, and then within that we have two in which Rossetti uses a sort of ballad form. So ballads were popular verses, they were anonymous, and in the 19th century, with the rise of the Romantic movement and an interest in popular art and ordinary people, ballads became very popular. Old ones were reprinted, and poets began to write their own ballads. Ballads originally are quick-moving narrative poems with lots of dramatic acts. They use dialogue but few images. Okay, very interesting. They're not poetic necessarily in a way we may think of poetry. They use simple language, internal rhyme, repetition and formulaic phrases. Very often they had a refrain, like a little verse chorus. Ballads written in quatrains, that is 4-line stanzas, often rhyming A, B, C, B. So you can see from that, not too many rhymes, just 2. 7 or 8 syllable lines, and the rhythm comes from the shorter 2nd and 4th lines, the lines that rhyme. So, good revision activity for you. What features of narrative poetry can you identify in Maud Clare and or An Apple Gathering? Evaluate how Rossetti uses them. So go back to that narrative slide, find the features. And then what features of ballad form can you identify and explain how Rossetti uses them? That's really good practice, okay, because that's talking about form in specific poems and its effect. Okay, now this is a much more broad form, just this term lyric. Okay, it doesn't necessarily demand a rhyme scheme or a line length or anything like that. Lyric poem is defined by its content and its mood. So lyric poems are short poems, and that short is relative, yeah, shorter than Goblin Market. A short poem in which personal feelings are expressed in the first person. And often when we think about lyric poetry, we think about intense feelings, intense emotions. Lyrical means sounding musical. Lyric poetry was originally, and when we say originally, we mean by Greeks and Romans, classical poets, originally sung to music. So the poets will have, seen a picture of a lyre. It's sort of like a little harp. It's become a symbol of poetry. So the poet would play the harp and say their poems. Rossetti's lyric poems often written in 8-line stanzas. So here are the examples of lyric poems: Twice, Echo, these aren't the only ones, A Birthday, A Christmas Carol. So identify and evaluate Rossetti's use of lyric form in one of these named poems. It's an activity for that. There are more lyric poems. I'm a bit annoyed they're not all on there now. I will add them. And then the sonnet, which hopefully you're all fairly familiar with this idea now. Sonnets, 14-line poems written in iambic pentameter, adhering to tightly structured thematic organisation, i.e. organised by theme, by idea. In English, there are 2 sonnet forms, the Petrarchan and the Shakespearean. Rossetti uses the Petrarchan form in Remember. There are 2 rhymes in the octave, and after the turn or volta, there are 3 in the sestet. Remember to only talk about turns or voltas in sonnets, please. The octave presents the situation and the sestet comes to a conclusion about it. That's in Remember, and very often actually that's how sonnets use the form. So, top task, identify all of Rossetti's sonnets in the selection we're studying. Decide whether they use Petrarchan or Shakespearean form, and then have a go at this task. Evaluate the effectiveness of how Rossetti uses the structure of the sonnet in any of them, but not Remember, because we've talked about Remember the most. Okay, so look at the others. And finally, I don't think I told you this when we were looking at a help meet for him, but it is in a specific poetic form called a roundel. And this was devised by the poet Algernon Swinburne, who was part of the wider Pre-Raphaelite circle. So if you remember, Rossetti's brother Dante was a painter, an artist, and he formed this group, the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, who painted these very rich, erotic, detailed, elaborate decorative paintings, often with medieval settings, but they also included other people, poets, and if you remember, Rossetti herself had a poem published in their Pre-Raphaelite magazine. So it's a sort of a wider cultural movement. And he created this form called the roundel. 3 stanzas. The first and the third end with a refrain. A refrain is a repeated line, like a chorus. It may be a half line. The rhyme scheme goes A-B-A-R, B-A-B, A-B-A-R, and R is that refrain. So the last line of the first stanza and the last line of the last stanza. Rossetti uses this form in a help meet for him. So my question for you is, what is the effect? Okay, so off you go. You can go do some Rossetti revision now.